Mr. Steiner, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Let's begin with the triple whammy of COVID, climate change, and conflict around the world that has erased many of the achievements against poverty alleviation. Developing countries, as we know, have been especially hit hard. So what is UNDP doing to address some of that and to also bring it back in line?
Well, you mentioned three major crises that were not really expected, certainly not in this magnitude. One that you have not explicitly mentioned is also the fiscal crisis, because on the back of the pandemic, on the back of now an economic and financial crisis and debt crisis for many countries, the biggest challenge is how do countries that have no fiscal resources left, how do they invest in coming out of this crisis? We have examined 95 countries together with their stakeholders and governments on how they are responding. Development is about moving forward. Development is about addressing poverty, but also investing in, for example, digital public infrastructure, because this is one of the greatest drivers right now of progress and recovery.
We also are seeing unprecedented climate events, wildfires, floods, fiery temperatures. We already know that 2023 will be the hottest on record. UNDP has launched an exhibit called Dear World Leaders at this year's UN General Assembly. Tell us a little bit about that and the message behind it.
You know, when the world sees leaders arrive at the United Nations, particularly for the General Assembly high-level segment in September, people think this is just a talk shop. And yes, there is a lot of talk that happens here. But it is also a moment where leaders are confronted with questions, sometimes from their counterparts in other countries, sometimes from the public. In New York, there was a major climate march yesterday. We know all around the world, young people are looking to their leaders for wise decisions, bold decisions. So the Dear World Leaders campaign is a way of bringing these voices right into the corridors. In fact, literally speaking, UNDP has an exhibit where heads of state and government are meeting, having their bilateral meetings with about 15 television screens, playing these messages from citizens across the world.
We are at this very critical moment with the Sustainable Development Goals, about halfway through. Talk about the timeline. It seems that very few of the goals are on track. And the Secretary General is calling for a renewed push to meet those SDGs 2030 right down the road.
Well, the good news is at the SDG Summit in New York, actually world leaders recommitted to the goals. They have endorsed the declaration, and I think this was the first objective of bringing the world together for an SDG summit in order to reflect on whether, because of the setbacks that have been the product of a pandemic that we never planned for in 2015, or an economic and financial crisis, wars and conflicts that have happened to us as a world family since 2015, yes, we have lost momentum. We have seen setbacks, and on many goals, we have not progressed as we had hoped as a world family. So this week was a moment to say, this is half time. Are we going to do better in the second half? And are we committed to working together on this? And I think the first signal coming out of New York is an unequivocal yes.
China has put a lot of emphasis on sustainable development in programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, now celebrating 10 years. And the Global Development Initiative, how has China impacted the push to achieve the SDGs, and what can other countries learn from China?
Many people in today's world do not know that China has, over the last 35 years, with its deliberate and targeted development policies, not only become an industrial power, if you want, but also lifted over 700 million people out of poverty. This is an extraordinary achievement, and I think it is one that in many developing countries is being studied today as what is it that enabled China to do that? And I think that alone is something that has also influenced the way that many developing countries now look to China as a potential partner. So when China began to invest in the Belt and Road Initiative and more recently articulated the Global Development Initiative, I think it was in the minds of many a welcome signal to invest in the development of others.
I want to touch on gender equality. Another key mandate of UNDP is gender equality. A report by UN Women in conjunction with the UNDP says, and I'm going to read you this quote, No country has achieved full gender parity, and fewer than 1% of women and girls live in a country with high women's empowerment and a small gender gap. And further, the report says that globally, women achieve only 60% of their full potential. How do you address that?
I think UNDP has become a partner to countries where we enable countries to look at themselves through the lens of gender equality or inequality and define out of their own sense of fairness, justice, and a deep commitment to equity, that these issues need to be addressed as part of a national development process. How often does a woman not have even the basic conditions with which to walk into a bank and be able to obtain a loan, even though women are very often central to agriculture and to small, medium-scale enterprises and trade? So the emergence of digital finance, the ability of women to be able to access and transact on cell phones in order to have access to a financial system that for the better part of the last century they have often been excluded from, has revolutionized the issue of women in finance. And I think this is the challenge of our generation. Let's fast forward. Let's not take excuses, and let's not take the privilege of men as an excuse to essentially deny women where their rights are unequally available to them. But more importantly, society is losing an extraordinary amount of productivity, ingenuity, leadership because of these constraints.
Mr. Achim Steiner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.